Thanks for joining me on episode 417 of the Inspired Stewardship Podcast.
I'm Bob Loddick from Seed Time, and I challenge you to invest in yourself, invest in others, develop your influence, and impact the world by using your time, your talent, and your treasures to live out your calling. Having the ability to grow your money like a seed is key to learning God's way of handling money. And one way to be inspired to do that is to listen to this, the Inspired Stewardship Podcast with my friend Scott Mater.
And this is an example of also going first. Both Jesus going first in leading, showing the example to the disciples of here's how you do servanthood, here's how you do servant leadership. This is what it looks like. Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. If you truly desire to become the person who God wants you to be, then you must learn to use your time, your talent, and your treasures for your true calling. In the Inspired Stewardship Podcast, you will learn to invest in yourself, invest in others, and develop your influence so that you can impact the world. In today's Spiritual Foundation episode about investing in yourself, I talk with you about John chapter 13, verses 3 through 15, why this idea is a mark of not just servanthood, but intimacy, and how being willing to go first shows a way to build relationships. You know, yesterday, Julie and I were talking, and Julie referenced this passage from John chapter 13. And let me go through it real quick. This is a familiar passage to most of us, but in case you don't recall it, it's at the Last Supper. It's during the time of Passover, and it's as the disciples and Jesus are getting together and gathering in the upper room. And it goes that starting in chapter 13, verse 3, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, why do you wash my feet?" And Jesus answered him, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand." And Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." And Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet, but also my hands and my head." And Jesus said to him, "The one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." For he knew who was to betray him, and that was why he said, "Not all of you are clean." When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you should also do just as I have done for you." You know, this passage is used as a reason for servanthood. It's an example of somebody who's in a leadership position, a supreme position, bending down and taking care of others. And it's certainly that. This story is definitely an example of that. But it's also an example of intimacy. And what I mean by that is this. See, back in this day and time, washing your feet in a very real act was one of intimacy. The person that generally washed your feet was either a slave, somebody who you had complete power over, or your spouse, who, again, at this day and time, women were often not in a real position of power. And so, again, there was this degree of control over that person. And the reason for that, the part of the reason at least for this, was because if you think about it, if I can look at your feet, I can tell something about where you've been. I can tell something about what you've been doing. It gives me information about what you've been up to. It's a supreme act of intimacy and trust to expose your feet in this way. It's also one of intimacy. And in a way, Jesus was also challenging the disciples to show them where they'd been, to come on this journey with him. Not just in a literal way, but in a figurative way as well. And then what he's doing is challenging us to go first also, to wash each other's feet. In other words, the disciples together should not just serve others out into the world, but should turn to each other and serve each other in this same sort of intimate, caring way. It's also one of non-judgmental. You don't hear Jesus saying, I can't believe your feet look like this, or anything judgmental in this relationship, because it's one of trust. You have to trust the person who you're exposing this to. I would argue that in a very real way, this act of foot washing is a sacrament. A sacrament is defined as something that Jesus did and that Jesus commanded us to do for others. And if you listen to this passage, it says you ought to wash one another's feet. Jesus did it, and he's telling us to go out and do it. I would argue that this is a sacrament, and yet even today in the church, it's not one that we can do for each other very easily because of the degree of intimacy even today that foot washing brings. If you've ever been doing part of a foot washing ceremony, either as the person washing feet or having your feet washed by others, you know what I'm talking about. There is a degree to which it is almost like showing somebody some part of you that is kept very private. You have to have a certain amount of trust. You have to have a certain amount of understanding to be able to do this. It's also one that touches on us in that when I've done this, when I participated in foot washing ceremonies, I am always moved. Probably in part because it's just something that we don't do. It's not a natural part of our behavior anymore. We wash our feet whenever we take a bath or take a shower, but it's not like when we come over to someone else's house, we take off our shoes and there's a servant who washes our feet. That was much more of the norm back in this time. And this is an example of also going first. Both Jesus going first in leading, showing the example to the disciples of here's how you do servanthood. Here's how you do servant leadership. This is what it looks like to not worry about who's the best, to not worry about who comes first, but to actually just care for others. But it's also one of Jesus saying, here's also an example of the intimacy that you need to have with each other if you're really going to be in community with each other. This is how you can actually show your love for each other. Not just in the physical act of foot washing, but in the intimacy behind it, in the trust that's behind it, in the caring that's behind it. It's not just about the physical act, it's about the meaning behind it. So whether it's literally washing someone else's feet or whether there's a figurative act that you need to do to show others how much you care for them and how much you want to serve them, in what way can you go out this week and wash others' feet? Thanks for listening. Thanks so much for listening to the Inspired Stewardship podcast. As a subscriber and listener, we challenge you to not just sit back and passively listen, but act on what you've heard and find a way to live your calling. If you enjoyed this episode, do me a favor. Go over to facebook.com/inspired stewardship And like our Facebook page and mark it that you'd like to get notifications from us so that we can connect with you on Facebook and make sure that we're serving you to the best of our abilities with time and tips there. Until next time, invest your time, your talent, and your treasures. Develop your influence and impact the world.